Walked out of Wonju, huh? There's a song in that somewhere. Hey, so what happened to him? He got walked out of Korea. Okay, I guess that's the second verse, huh? Yeah. See it. January 14th, 1950. The communist forces have invaded the South again, launching mighty attacks against the hastily made UN defensive lines, even taking the southern capital, Seoul. So yet another military disaster, yeah? On the contrary, this time, the result is tens of thousands of dead communist soldiers. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the forces of Communist China occupied Seoul. The UN forces had foreseen this eventuality, though, and conducted a good fighting retreat and avoided panic. Further fighting in the east forced the UN to retreat back to Line D, though, and 2 North Korean corps in the east prepared to make their move. Let's take a moment to look at the situation over there. At the start of this week, things look a bit like this. The South Korean, ROK, 2nd Division has been placed into 10th Corps Reserve south of Chongju, with only around 3,000 troops left to its name. ROK 5th and 8th Divisions have also joined 10th Corps Commander Ned Almond's forces for the time being, and they guard 10th Corps' left from the Han River to near Wonju. The area between Wonju and Yongju is the responsibility of U.S. 2nd and 7th Divisions, 2nd in the north and 7th in the south, with elements overlapping in the center. East of that, there is the gap that the North Korean KPA 2nd Corps have begun to drive through, then ROK defense lines the rest of the way to the east coast, manned by the ROK 3rd and 1st Corps. Before the fight around Wonju even really gets going, though, a blunder immediately threatens the UN position. It actually comes at the tail end of last week, when 2nd Division Commander Robert McClure thinks his position in Wonju will soon be difficult to defend as the KPA 5th Corps hits the ROK units to McClure's west. So without permission from Almond, McClure pulls his men out of the town and even beyond the hills to the south. From here, his troops can only attack Wonju with artillery. When Almond gets wind of this, he is not pleased. Almond had no intention of depending on artillery alone. Wonju, in his judgment, was so important and indeed so rare a road junction that any force controlling it had gone far towards controlling Central Korea. After learning of the 2nd Division's deep withdrawal, he ordered McClure to at least send 1 infantry battalion at first light on the 8th to clear the town and airstrip to occupy the high ground directly south of Wonju with no fewer than 4 battalions and not to withdraw from that position unless Almond himself gave the order. They try this, but find the area around Wonju is now crawling with North Koreans who fight over the town with elements of 2nd Division for the rest of the week without a clear victor. On the 13th, Almond contacts 8th Army Commander Matt Ridgway and asks for permission to relieve McClure from his command. Ridgway gives it to him, and McClure is sent back to the States and replaced by Clark Ruffner. KPA troops also keep hitting that gap that I mentioned between U.S. 10th Corps and ROK 3rd Corps, and heavy fighting goes on there all week. The goal of the overall push is to take Wonju, Checheon, Tanyang, and then Daegu. Achieving these objectives and controlling the road networks that link them would give the communists total dominion over the center of Korea, able to move and attack at will, and supply and communication would be in crisis mode for the UN forces. The weather is certainly on the KPA side this week, as blizzards and storms wreck the ability of UN planes to deliver any close air support to 10th Corps. In fact, they record the lowest number of daily sorties since last July on the 10th. They do fly some strategic missions in regions with better weather, hitting things like Chinese-controlled airfields. When UN units see combat with the KPA this week, the UN forces perform very well. The ROK units are holding too, even if they are taking more casualties than the American ones. But despite taking massive casualties, the North Koreans are threatening breakthrough at the gap by sheer weight of numbers. So as a contingency plan, Ridgway orders O.P. Smith's 1st Marine Division, still recovering from its ordeal at the Chosin Reservoir, to move from their gathering point at Masan up north towards Andong to guard the main supply route and the roads to Daegu and Pohangdong. They're still around 2,000 men short of a full complement, but they have most of their equipment, high morale and are basically combat ready, and in any case, whatever comes their way should be a cakewalk after what they went through in November and December. But by the end of the week, the front here is starting to stabilize. Fighting goes on, but it's looking more like there are enough UN forces here to beat back the KPA, whose divisions are by now well below combat strength. It's becoming a question of when rather than if they call off their attacks. It also seems like Ned Almond and Matt Ridgway have managed to build a real working relationship. Even with Almond being MacArthur's guy? And why does Almond escape blame for the disaster to the 10th Corps 4, 5, and 6 weeks ago? Well, he doesn't really. There are plenty of people in 8th Army and in the 1st Marine Division who have little time for him and see him as part of the problem. The thing is that for all his faults, he's still an aggressive general, and what Ridgway needs right now and lacks is aggressive generals. There's also no reason to unnecessarily antagonize MacArthur at this point. If a showdown between him and Ridgway is going to come, Ridgway's going to save it for something more important. Almond, though, does need to be brought into line. He needs to be told in no uncertain terms that being favored by MacArthur is not going to get him any special treatment in 8th Army anymore, and he should not try pulling the same nonsense with Ridgway that he did with Walker. Bill McCaffrey had accompanied Almond on the day he met with Ridgway for the first time. It had been a long meeting and hardly a happy one. Almond had gone inside alone with Ridgway, with McCaffrey waiting outside. McCaffrey could tell from Almond's mood afterwards that he was badly shaken. He had emerged quite deflated, still a Corps commander, but that and nothing more. A man who had just been told in a very tough way the new rules of the headquarters, and that he was no longer going to play games with the 8th Army commander. Ridgway has grown unhappy with some of his other commanders, as we saw last week, despite the general improvement in 8th Army. On the 8th, he writes Army Chief of Staff Lightning Joe Collins back in Washington and complains about the quality of commanders available to him, saying the Army should pour on the heat in our training, and above all, let's be ruthless with our general officers if they fail to measure up. As it happens, Collins has been meaning to visit the theater and speak to both MacArthur and Ridgway in person. So today, the 14th, he's on his way. Next week, Ridgway will have his first chance to really sit down and tell Washington specifically what he needs in terms of leaders. Even beyond generals and colonels, though, Ridgway has been thinking about what kind of army he wants to build in Korea. While MacArthur continues to insist that more and more divisions are needed to hold back the Chinese, Ridgway is less certain of that. He is, creative with his requests, more interested in getting the American forces back to fighting the kind of war they fight best, one of superiority of equipment and firepower. If he can't have more divisions, then he'll settle for more artillery battalions, reserve ones, National Guard ones, anything they can offer him. Just get those big guns in the field. With enough artillery and air power, Ridgway is convinced he can bring so many bombs and shells down on the heads of the Chinese and North Koreans that he can break their fighting spirit. The extra artillery he has asked for is given to him. On January 11th, just 2 weeks after he had arrived in the country, he wrote his friend Ham Hayslip, the Army's Vice Chief of Staff. The power is here. The strength and the means we have, short perhaps of Soviet military intervention. My one overriding problem, dominating all others, is to achieve the spiritual awakening of the latent capabilities of this command. If God permits me to do that, we shall achieve more, far more than our people think possible, and perhaps inflict a bloody defeat on the Chinese, which even China will long remember, wanton as she is with the sacrifice of lives. The Air Force has also been doing solid work too. Although bad weather has limited operations this week, more than half of the casualties taken by the communist forces in this recent offensive have been inflicted by UN air power, and strategic bombing from B-29s has rendered most of what the Chinese have captured useless. But still, on the surface, the offensive looks like it's gone well for the communists. Another 80 kilometers or so of territory occupied, including the South Korean capital. Another 13,000 casualties taken by the UN forces. But this success is an illusion. A hollow victory, if a victory at all. 8th Army has not been on the brink at any point, has fought back to inflict 3 times as many losses as they've taken, and hasn't really ceded an inch of ground to the enemy that they weren't okay giving up. The communist forces now faced an enemy who for the first time seemed prepared to settle down and fight a careful, thorough, professional war. For 8th Army, far from being cast down by its further retreat, now began to snap back, to utilize its extensive advantages of firepower and mobility, and to wage a war that it was actually, to everyone's surprise and delight, pretty good at. Ridgway is even preparing a modest counterattack, set to begin tomorrow, the 15th. Oh, hey, also this week, the ceasefire committee at the UN that I talked about last week comes back with its list of principles. These are unveiled the 11th and basically suggest that a ceasefire agreement must be a prelude to a wider discussion on Asia. In Korea, the committee says that foreign troops should be withdrawn incrementally and the Korean people should determine their own future democratically. After this, a body would be created by the UN General Assembly containing representatives from America, Britain, the USSR, and Mao Zedong's Communist China. Korea would be discussed, as would Taiwan, and a formal ending to the Chinese Civil War, along with UN recognition and a seat at the UN for Communist China. All parties would have the opportunity to air their grievances and discuss a solution which ultimately all sides are content with. This is something the U.S. is incredibly hesitant to accept. There's a big danger for them with putting key foreign policy issues like Korea or Taiwan in the hands of an international body. The danger being they may get outvoted on those issues. If such a conference went ahead and the U.S. ended up having to make concessions over Taiwan, that would be political kryptonite for the Truman administration. But they can't really decline the proposals outright while still keeping their major allies on their side and labeling China as the aggressor. So, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson gambles. He advises that the U.S. accept the list of principles, and he counts on China rejecting them. He thinks they will. He can't see Mao agreeing to call time on a war that the Chinese are still on paper winning. But if the Chinese do unexpectedly accept, the U.S. could find itself in a diplomatic quagmire. But we'll see how that works out in future, for this week of the war has come to its close. The whole front has settled down quite a lot by today, save for floundering KPA attacks in the east, which really don't look like they're going anywhere. Ridgway's improvements are starting to show. That said, advancing is a very different proposition from just holding. 8th Army have shown they can stand and fight, sure, but whether they have what it takes to actually take the fight to the Chinese remains to be seen. For Douglas MacArthur back in Tokyo, any possibility of the expanded war he seeks seems to have slipped away. Every message he receives from Washington now is a little firmer and more assertive than the last. The MacArthur myth was dispelled in a way by Ridgway's arrival in Korea. The man in Tokyo was no longer the terrible, imposing figure who commanded respect and deference at home and abroad, but became an old man crying out for another chance of glory, and just perhaps a few years past his shelf life. And the new guy on the ground is doing what MacArthur has repeatedly and recently claimed to be impossible to do without huge reinforcements, without expanding the war into China, and without dropping the bomb. At this point, it's beginning to seem like a case of when, rather than if, the Joint Chiefs and the President will run out of patience with Douglas MacArthur.